be handing things over to Bill. If you have any questions, please just post them in the chat area. Any questions that you have there, we'll try to answer. I'll text during the presentation there to help anybody with any technical issues, and then also we'll address any questions that you have towards the end of the presentation. And so with that, here's Bill Ross. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you so much to everyone out there that took time tonight to come and listen to me preach for an hour. I really appreciate that, and certainly we appreciate you, Jeff, and Social Flight in making this possible for us, and your support of general aviation. We really appreciate that. Tonight we're going to talk about choosing a maintenance provider that is competent. And in my career, which if you've listened to any of my seminars or any of the webinars in this series, I've worked as a mechanic, I've worked as a charter pilot, corporate pilot, and took care of the airplanes. I've been with Continental about 14 years now, and have found I think my niche in product support and Continental Motor Services, where I really get to engage with the customer and learn about the customer and learn about some of the things that some of the struggles and the hurdles that we share with aircraft ownership. I own 3 airplanes myself, and so I know firsthand how that is, and what the pride and some of the agony of aircraft ownership can be. Tonight, what I want to do is talk about things that I believe are important questions that you as owners should ask of your mechanic. And in the long run, you will have a safer airplane, and you will have a lower cost per hour, or lower cost of total aircraft ownership as our engine goes to and beyond TBO. So tonight we're going to focus in on the mechanic and those questions that you should ask. Also, I will provide an avenue for some education of your mechanic if he needs, or you feel that he needs to get some Continental Motors training if he's maintaining your Continental Motors powered aircraft. We'll provide some information with regards to that. But one of the things that I'd like to start off with a little story. People tell me that I make short stories long, but I'll try to make a long story short. But I'm often on the phone with owners that are struggling with some problem with their aircraft. And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. I'll ask the question, does your mechanic understand the Continental engine? And I get the reply that, well, my mechanic has worked for XYZ airline for 34 years, and he is a great mechanic. He's an A&P IA. And what that tells me right away is that it is quite probable that that mechanic is not really the person to be working on your Continental engine. You know, an A&P license is a license to learn. It's an easy thing to obtain. Hell, they gave me one, so it can't be that hard. And inspection authorization is just another test, but it's not necessarily testing you on products that you may be working on. And then when the phrase came out about the experience on the airline, well, I think I'd like for that mechanic to be working on the airliner that I'm flying in, but I don't know whether or not he's really, truly capable of working on the Continental engine. So tonight we're going to explore some of those questions. Along the way, some of the things that we're going to look at is fuel system calibration and adjustment. If you're out there and you fly a Continental engine that's fuel injected, that's a very important item of maintenance. It's probably the most often overlooked item of maintenance. We need to understand and make sure that our mechanics or maintenance providers are versed in that and that have the proper training and tools to do the job. Oil change requirements, believe it or not, we can tell a whole lot about the internal functioning of an engine and engine health through oil change. Turbine mechanics look at recip engines a little different. So we want someone who's got experience with that in looking at both oil analysis and the constituents that one may find in the oil filter. Cylinder compression tests. Just at Sun and Fun this year, I had an owner who came to the booth that reported a compression. I won't tell you, I'll go into that later, but reported a compression. His mechanic was ready to pull the cylinder and thought that there was a problem, and it was quite obvious that the mechanic had not done the compression test in accordance with Continental Motors instructions. Baffles is another a big thing in cooling of the engine. I will show you an example of a overheating problem that we were having on a Bonanza, and when I interviewed the mechanic on the phone, he indicated to me that the baffles were perfect, and I'll point out how they weren't. So it's very important that your mechanics and all understand that. Induction system inspections, we can learn a lot from that as well, and some questions that we should be asking of our maintenance provider. And then there are some maintenance-induced issues that I'll tell you along the way, and show you some examples of things that can happen when you don't have the proper people working on your aircraft. And then we'll also talk a little bit how Continental Motors and Continental Motor Services can support you, the Continental owner, on down the road. So let's jump into fuel system calibration and adjustment. I ask this question in seminars that I'm speaking in. I asked it at Sun and Fun, just got back from Sun and Fun where I spoke in some of the forums. And if we had 100 people in a room, and I always ask this question, first of all, if you fly a Continental fuel-injected engine, raise your hand. And, 75 out of 100 people raise their hand that they fly that. Then I ask, if you fly a fuel-injected Continental engine and you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that your maintenance provider, that your mechanic, is adjusting and calibrating your fuel system at least at every annual and has the tools, equipment, training to do so, please raise your hand. And out of 75, I may have 3 people that raise their hand. And folks, this is a very important item of maintenance that is essential to cylinder life. It's essential to the longevity of the engine and performance. When should it be done? This is the question that you need to ask your maintenance provider. Did you set my fuel system, and when are you doing it? It should be done when an engine is installed, when there's a fuel system component change. If you take Continental injectors out and you put GAMI injectors in, or you replace a fuel pump or a line or a nozzle, it doesn't matter. Whatever component is changed, you need to have your mechanic reset that fuel system. It's very, very critical. Scheduled maintenance and 100-hour or annual inspections. And we have to do this because the engine does wear, and these components of the fuel system do wear over the life of the engine. Anytime that you have a fuel flow anomaly, if you have a mechanic that is automatically attacking your airplane with tools and changing components without troubleshooting, that mechanic is costing you money. I'm here to tell you that in my career, I've seen only one fuel pump that failed. and it failed in a agricultural airplane that had so much dirt in the pump that it seized it and sheared the shaft. But fuel pumps are changed all the time in a matter of troubleshooting, because we have mechanics out there that are not trained on the Continental product. They don't have the technical data, and they don't have the tools to troubleshoot it properly. So if you have a fuel flow anomaly, like the engine's dying on rollout, or you see a quiver of the fuel flow gauge, before we go and start changing components, an astute and trained mechanic would put his calibrated gauges on your engine, even though you may have the latest in Shaden and JPI instrumentation. He has to use his calibrated instruments to look and see what's actually going on with that engine so that he can troubleshoot that engine effectively. As I said, it's essential to cylinder and engine longevity. You've got to have the fuel pressure set correctly. It's key to cylinder head temperature. It's key to maintaining cylinder head temperatures within parameters. Oh, but Bill, I note the fuel flow on takeoff, and my fuel flow is on the mark. That's not the target. The target is the metered pressure, and we'll go more in depth into that in a moment. But you can't even begin to talk about cooling of the engine unless that's set up correctly. Also, we can't begin to talk about Lena peak and best power and engine management unless that fuel system is set properly. Now, what does your mechanic need to be doing, and what are the questions that you need to ask? You should reference SID97-3 in its latest revision, or the engine maintenance manual. It's nothing that you have to go write down. A lot of the things that I'll be talking about, I'll be speaking of bulletins and service information directives and service bulletins and things like that tonight. You don't need to write all that down. You can go to our website at continentalmotors.aero. You can go to support materials and click on service bulletins, and anything that you want information about, you can do a keyword search, and you can get, for example, keyword fuel. You get everything, every bulletin, every service information letter or directive that's been written on fuel will populate there, and you can print that out and review it with your mechanic. And SID97-3 is the instructions for calibrating that fuel system. In the picture there to the left, you'll see a technician that's using a $4,000 Portatest here that we have at the factory, but you don't necessarily need that to set the fuel system up. In fact, 2 calibrated gauges is all your mechanic needs, along with a few lines and some swivel tees and connectors, and he's in good shape. I'd like to point out to the right in the slide there's our barber pole tag, and that barber pole tag actually states that before the engine is returned to service, or the component is returned to service, that the fuel system be calibrated in accordance with the latest edition of 97-3 or the latest revision of the Engine Maintenance Manual, Aircraft Manufacturer's Maintenance Manual. That is affixed to every engine that leaves Continental to the front of the engine on the crankshaft. Every fuel system component has the same tag. You'd be surprised at the number of people who discard that and throw it in the wastebasket, and I'm talking about mechanics. Make sure that your mechanic is familiar with fuel system calibration. When you ask the question after the webinar, you go home, you go to maybe this weekend you go to see your mechanic and you ask him, or you call him on the phone, and you say, hey, I listened to this guy from Continental and says you need to set my fuel system. Have you been doing it? You may get a reply that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Bill Ross is trying to make busy work for you. and they set the fuel system from the factory, so you don't need to do that. That's far from the truth. You probably would be in a dilemma there as to what do you do, and you have two choices, in my opinion. You can get another mechanic, or you can have that mechanic trained here at the factory. If you, as an owner, would like to come to the factory with your mechanic and train in an advanced technical training class, we would love to have you both. In fact, we have a lot of owners that bring their mechanic. We have a lot of owners that come by themselves because not necessarily to be able to work on their airplanes and maintain their airplanes, but to ensure that they're asking the right questions and that they are ensuring that the person working on their airplane, working on their engine, is competent. He has the tools, equipment, and training and technical data to be working on the engine. It is very, very important that you ask that question. So if he's not heard of 97.3, he doesn't have the calibrated gauges, or he believes that the system was set at the factory, then you need to make one of those decisions. I'll go back just a minute. Let me speak just a moment on why this is necessary. When we run the fuel system components here at the factory, we on a test bed, for example, a fuel pump. A fuel pump is flowed on a test bench using Stoddard solvent. It's used on a flow versus pressure curve. And that ensures that that fuel pump will function throughout the engineering designed range of operation. When that fuel pump is installed on a real live breathing engine, the head pressure into the pump is different. The exhaust system and the intake system on these engines can affect the fuel system and how it needs to be adjusted. So there's many, many factors and many, many variables that need to be considered and why it has to be done. And we can go into that in another webinar, another presentation as to why. But the basic thing you need to get out of this seminar tonight, this webinar tonight, is let's ask the question, are you doing it? And you can find a lot of information in that Service Information Directive 97.3 that you can read, print it out, read it, and then review it with your mechanic. There's a lot of reasons why and variables as to why that fuel system needs to be calibrated. Also, with oil change requirements and oil changes, this is another area that recommend that you review with your mechanic. Ask your mechanic, did you cut my filter, and examine it? Was there any change from the last inspection? That's what we're doing when we cut filters. These engines by nature will make some metal. A turbine mechanic that's used to looking at turbine filters will have a stroke when he looks in a recip engine because of the amount of material that can be found, and can be a very benign sample and very, very normal. Now, certainly we don't want to start reading part numbers within our filter, but a little wear material is acceptable, and what your mechanic should be looking for is a relative change over time. So did you cut my filter? Are you doing that every time? Was there any change from the last inspection? And something that's very new that I want to point out tonight is, did you make a mess? This is an area that is becoming a very big problem, and if you owners out there are changing the oil in your aircraft by yourself, which is something you certainly can do, you need to ask yourself, or I'm asking you, do you cut a hole or do you punch a hole in the filter before you remove the filter so that you don't make a mess? We want to drain that oil from the filter. Why? Because the dumb engineers turned it upside down and made it impossible to get to, so that when you pull it off, it's going to make a mess. I'm here to tell you tonight, do not ever do that. Do not ever punch a hole in a filter. If you're not changing your oil and you're having your mechanic do it, you need to ask him, is he punching holes in it? And if he is, you need to have him stop immediately. The reason is, in this slide here, you will see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen there, in that picture to the left, that's a piece of filter material. And what we've seen, and I've been on the inspection of 3 catastrophic engine failures as a result of this. People are punching and piercing the canister, and they can't control the amount of force that's going, that they're piercing the canister with, and the screwdriver or the prick or whatever they're using can come in contact with the filter material and push it into the inlet of the pump. When you start the engine, that tiny piece of oil filter material finds its way to some place that it can block. And in a couple of cases that I've been in, it resulted in a catastrophic engine failure, and I've had a host of them that stopped the feed to the oil feed to the starter adapter and starved it for oil. So it is a very, very serious matter, and Continental recommends that you ask your mechanic to stop doing that now. If you're doing it as an owner, please stop. Now, I know there may be people out there right now that are saying to themselves, yeah, but Bill Ross, hey, I don't hit it that hard. I only punch it a little bit. And my response, and don't mean to be smart, Alec, but I'd like to ask you, when was the last time that your elbow was calibrated? And so, you know, I'm a big guy, and a light force that I consider a light force, I could maybe do damage. So please ask your mechanics, are they doing it? And if they are, they need to stop, and this is why. It's very, very important, and it's a very serious matter that can cost you a lot of money. What do? I take a gallon freezer bag and put it under the filter, wrap it around, and unscrew it and let all of the oil drain into that plastic bag. And that works pretty well for most Continental installations that I've found to avoid doing this practice. We have worked with Tempest, and Tempest company does have a tool that you can wrap around the filter, and it has a calibrated a screw that you can twist the handle, and it will pierce the canister, and it will let the oil flow out through a tube and down into a bucket, and that works very, very well. But never use a screwdriver or anything like that. Your mechanic should know what the latest revision is for approved oils. We get calls all the time. What type of oil do I put in my engine? My mechanic doesn't know. Well, your mechanic should have a copy of Service Information Letter 99-2, and you as owners should also have that document as well, so that you know what is approved for your Continental engine. Intervals should be at 25 hours for a screen, and oil filter, depending upon size, can be 50 to 100 hours. We recommend 50 hours for most Part 91 operations, but if there's a 135 operator that's flying 40 hours or so a month, there's no problem in going 100 hours on a long, tall filter. Never want to exceed 6 months, and make sure that you're monitoring your oil consumption rates, and that you're reporting that to your mechanic over time, looking for a relative change. What I do in my airplanes is I have a little notebook, and I note the time and the amount of oil that's added, so that I can go back and I can track it over time and look for a relative change. It's important that you, as the owner, communicate that to the mechanic. So it's a two-way street. Limited oil consumption is normal. It helps to ensure lubrication of the cylinder walls. When we when we hone cylinders here at Continental, when we manufacture them, we do put a hone pattern in them. We purposely scratch the inside of the cylinder in a very methodical way so that it helps to retain oil. Oil consumption is something that's pretty dynamic. It can vary from one engine to another depending on how hard the engine is used and what type of operating conditions the engine is in. Your mechanic should cut the filter. After cutting the filter, we'll go back to that just a moment. They cut the canister and remove part of it, remove the filter. They're going to be looking for constituents within the pleats of the filter. And looking at, in this particular slide, is a normal oil filter, which we don't have, we certainly don't see any part numbers or anything in there. And there may be a few little flakes and specks and things like that, and that's what we're accustomed to seeing. An abnormal filter, we've got a relative change. All of a sudden we've got more wear metal. Your mechanic should be performing a more detailed inspection. If your mechanic is not able to do so, we will do that for you here at the factory. But what the mechanic should be doing, if he's capable, is washing the filter into a clean container. That container that you see there is, it looks like a dirty plastic container, but actually the technician is washing that filter into a clean Petri dish that we would look at under magnification and look at the particles within the Petri dish. If you look at this picture here in the left, you can see some of the particles that are showing up in this oil analysis. And we can identify your mechanic. You can tell a lot of things about the functioning of the engine based on what you're seeing in the Petri dish. For example, you can see Scotch-Brite. I've noted Scotch-Brite in filter samples before. Well, where did that come from? Well, there's a mechanic out there that's working and obviously he's been a little careless getting Scotch-Brite in the engine somewhere. Silica getting dirt. You can see dirt under magnification. Maybe we need to go look at the filter. Maybe we need to look at the alternate air door rigging. Maybe we need to look at the induction system as a whole. But we use that in concert with a oil analysis to again look at change over time. Your mechanic cannot do an oil analysis willy-nilly. He can't do it once and then not do it for a period of time, or take a snapshot at an engine. I've known mechanics that will actually do it once in a while, no schedule, or they'll do it on a pre-buy, even though the engine's never been on oil analysis. Talked to a mechanic not long ago that was looking at a Beechcraft Bonanza. Aircraft had been dormant for quite some time, I don't know, a few years, and the mechanic that was doing the pre-buy was going to do an oil analysis. Well, that's improper use of oil analysis. You do it the same time, the same company, the same way every time, and what we're looking for is a change over time. That's how an oil analysis is used, same as your mechanic cutting the filter. Cylinder compression test is another area where a mechanic could be costing you money. In the example that in the beginning of the presentation, had a gentleman that came up to me at Sun and Fun, and he reported a compression of 58, and his mechanic was ready to remove the cylinder and have them reworked or replaced. A balance pack of cylinders on a 6-cylinder Continental can be, if he purchased them, it can be $10,000. To rework one cylinder or 6 cylinders can be $500 to $700 a piece. Now, we want to sell you folks parts. I've got a daughter at the University of Alabama, and tuition's very expensive. But we don't want you to spend money unnecessarily. We want you to get the most out of the products that we make. And again, the mechanic that in the example of the Sun and Fun owner that came up, and his mechanic was having a fit at 58, doesn't understand the technical data that's laid out for compression testing by Continental Motors. Also, the mechanic did not own a borescope, so he could tell nothing about, in concert with our technical data, he could tell me nothing about the internal functioning of the engine. In fact, the owner at Sun and Fun came by the booth. He reported that. He said that his mechanic was with him. I said, please bring him by the booth. And the mechanic and I had a very good visit. I printed the bulletin out. I reviewed that document with the mechanic, and I had him understand how 60 is not the magic number and how important it is for him to have a borescope and how cheap they are to go get. So this was a good example that just happened the other day. Again, compression testing is a key word that you can do at our website under Service Bulletins. In Service Bulletin 03-3 are the instructions for performing a cylinder compression test. And engine has to be hot. A lot of mechanics do it cold. They're not doing an adequate test if they're doing it cold, and chances are they're costing you money. The other thing you need to ask is, are you doing the compression test in accordance with SBO 3-3, and do you have a compression tester and a master orifice tool? Well, what's the master orifice tool? In that picture there, you can see the compression tester. It's an Eastern Technologies E2M. That has a built-in master orifice tool. It's a 40 thousandths calibrated leak. When your mechanic starts the test, before he begins a compression test, he will establish the leak limit for the day. He will turn the regulator up to 80 pounds. He'll pressurize with the left-hand valve, move the right-hand valve to test, and he will read the leak limit on the right-hand gauge. My gauge here in Mobile, Alabama, just about on any given day, is somewhere between 39 and 42. And that's the leak limit that, if at or above, I can safely return the engine to service without any degradation to horsepower or torque or performance or danger to you, the aircraft owner. Many mechanics have got it stuck in their mind that 60 is the magic number. Many of you owners may have it stuck in your mind that 60 is the magic number, and that's simply not the case. Where did 60 come from? Because we've all heard that. We've all done compression tests on airplanes that we were considering purchasing, and if they were 60 or near 60 or below 60, we certainly felt that there was something wrong with the engine, and the world as we know it is coming to an end. 60 came from the FAA. We as mechanics have to use an advisory circular if in lieu of manufacturer's instructions. The FAA says use 60 if no instructions exist. Continental years ago looked at the compression testing and what does it do, what does it mean. And what we found out was really all the compression test is telling us is what the leak source is. It has really nothing to do with performance or functioning of the engine. In fact, we've tested engines with compression ratios, or not compression ratios, but compressions of 0, and found no difference in performance. But what we had to do was we had to come up with something that put everyone on the even playing field. And we did that through the master orifice tool. We did that by establishing a lower limit of static compression in which we may be able to detect an infinitesimal change in torque or horsepower. So you'd never feel it, but we could measure it maybe on a torque meter or on a dynamometer. And so that's how we came up with a 40 thousandths calibrated leak, and that's how we're able to go down to 40 on compressions and still be well within limits. Pound for pound, when you compare continental and Lycoming, continental compressions are typically lower. The ring gaps are loose, more loose on a continental engine than they are on a Lycoming. And remember, your compression tests of putting 80 pounds of shop air into the cylinder is not representative of what's happening in the engine under the dynamics of combustion and operation. We cannot simulate those on our test. We can't simulate the thermal expansion and how the combustion forces and the internal pressures are helping close valves and squeeze rings against the cylinder wall and make these seals. And that's why an engine with a compression of 0 could still make rated power. Now, I'm not telling you to go out there and fly your airplane with compressions of 0, but I am asking you to review with your mechanic Service Bulletin 03-3 and review those guidelines and ensure that he or she are doing the test in accordance with those guidelines. And I'll go back to the compression tester too. One of the things that you really need to look for with your mechanics, this goes for the compression tester, it goes for torque wrenches, it goes for gauging, it goes for a lot of different things. You should see a calibration sticker on his equipment. If you've got a mechanic that does not have a calibration sticker and a due date, you need to really evaluate whether or not this person is really who you want working on your aircraft. We have to calibrate these instruments, and that is extremely important. So make sure they're using a calibrated instrument for doing that. Your technician should also own a borescope. Many of them do not. But in order to maintain a Continental engine, you should have a borescope. That is the better of the two inspections that we do under SBO 3-3. We're doing two things. We're doing a compression test and we're doing a borescope inspection where we're looking in the cylinder with an optic scope and looking at the cylinder wall condition, looking to see if we see any scuffing, scoring, or anything that's a detriment into the cylinder. Oil pooling, oil fouling of spark plugs, intake and exhaust valve condition, and with training, your mechanic should be able to tell whether or not you have the proper amount or the average amount of combustion deposits. It's easy to tell how a pilot flies an airplane just by the borescope and looking at his combustion deposits. In this example here, for purposes of time, we'll limit it to valves, but in the borescope inspection at the top of the page, you'll see a normal valve. That's an actual photo that's taken with a borescope, and that's an actual valve, and you can see that the valve has a very concentric ring in the center, and that means that the heat is being dissipated 360 degrees throughout the circumference of the valve. If you look in the exhaust valve inspection results in the bottom of the slide, starting on the left-hand side, that's the better valve going progressively worse to the right. The one on the left has a concentric ring 360 degrees around the valve, and that means that the heat is being dissipated into the head very evenly all the way around the valve. In the number 2 there, moving to the right, the second valve, the heat is starting to become concentrated at the 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock position. And then moving further to the right, you can see that the heat is becoming very concentrated in one area at the 12 o'clock position. When we start to see that, that is definitely a burn valve, and we would we would recommend to the owner unscheduled maintenance in order to prevent what we see in the extreme right, where we've actually lost a piece of the valve. That is likely to not result in a catastrophic engine damage, but it is likely to get your attention and the attention of your wife or passengers when the engine starts to run extremely rough. So we can tell a lot just through the borescope inspection. Borescopes can run about $1,000 for the one that we recommend. It is not necessary that you get that exact model. Milwaukee and Snap-on and some of them have some very nice video scopes that are in the $300 range that are capable of taking pictures and have very good quality that your mechanic can use. So not having a borescope is not an excuse for a mechanic if he's working on your Continental engine. He's got to have it. Baffles is another thing that I'd like to talk about tonight. Make sure that your mechanic has inspected your baffling and that he understands how to seal that baffling and whether or not it needs to be replaced. This is a very, very important item of maintenance. It is crucial to engine cooling. Engines, most of the aircraft engines, the cooling air comes in on the top, and that pressure goes down through the cylinders. That high pressure moves down through the cylinders and cools the engine cylinders. It's very important. In this next example, this is kind of humorous because this engine reported a high cylinder head temperature on cylinder number 5, and engine was running kind of hot anyway. And when we were on the phone with the mechanic and doing the troubleshooting, the mechanic said that the baffling was fine. There was nothing wrong with the baffling. Well, we got the engine and got the airplane to our factory service center located in Fairhope, Alabama. And when I saw this and knew that the mechanic had reported this, I had to get out my camera and start taking some pictures for educational seminars like this. Because I want to point out some of the things that are wrong with the baffling. And first is that the baffle seal there at the top was not conforming to the upper cowling. There were cracks in the metal baffles that were allowing this escape of this high pressure air that should be going down through the cylinders is going back there, through the metal and helping keep the battery cool. We don't care about the battery being cool. We want the engine cylinders to be cool. Baffle seal not making very much contact with the cowling on the side there. And then lo and behold, the baffle seal was collapsed totally at cylinder number 5, so there was a large escape of air that was not going down through cylinder number 5 and not help keeping it cool. Kept the rocker cover very, very cool, but again, that's not the target. The target was the cooling fins in order to pull that heat away. This owner was a little disgusted in that his baffling was in the state of disrepair that it was. The engine was right at TBO, and he asked us at Fairhope at Continental Motor Services to go ahead and replace the engine and baffling, and here's a picture of the finished product. Now, that's a nice installation. He's got a good engine. He's got a good set of baffling. He's protecting that investment. So it is very important that your mechanic look at those baffles and the mechanic understand how that airflow goes through there and that it is sealed properly. I've had mechanics tell me that the baffling is fine. We send a technical representative out there for a hot running engine and we find a bird's nest in the inner cylinder baffling. So be very, very careful with regards to that, and make sure that you're asking that question, because that is essential to engine longevity. Induction inspection is very important too. Oil analysis can be related to the air filter. Your mechanic should understand that. If he starts to see areas of elevated dirt, silicon, he should be alerted to the air filter, to the alternate air door, to the air box. Is it rigged properly? Make sure that you're asking those questions. Make sure that he's servicing the air filter in accordance with the manufacturer instructions. I've been to shops where I've seen mechanics taking bracket air filters out with a wire brush and cleaning them with a wire brush. They're taking half the material off the filter, and there's no technical data for cleaning that filter. So be very careful about that. An ounce of prevention in this department is certainly worth a pound of cure. This is an actual induction system that we saw on an aircraft that we were on a trip, and so you got to take it very, very seriously, and your mechanic has to be astute to your engine, and if it's running hot, it could be a host of many things, first of which we need to check the baffling. Now, maintenance-induced issues, this is something that's key and probably the highlight of the presentation tonight. And as I conclude, I want to drive home this point. Are you qualified to work on my engine? Are you qualified to perform maintenance on my engine? Have you been to the Continental Factory School? And do you have, more important, do you have the current technical data? I'll tell you a quick story. I've done nothing other than aviation my entire life. In fact, I learned to fly and started flying when I was 16 years old. In fact, I could fly an airplane solo before I could drive out to the airport and in a car. But before I started flying, I wanted to be a mechanic. And another cohort of mine here at Continental, at 15 years old, we both decided that we would change a cylinder on his father's 182. He grew up near an airport. His father owned a 182. And we decided that we had worked on tractors and we had worked on this lawnmowers and things like that. And we knew how to make our go-karts run fast and all this stuff. So why couldn't we change a cylinder on an 0470? So we did, and we pulled the cylinder and we replaced the cylinder and we put it back together with a 1/2-inch ratchet wrench. We did not have the torque specifications. We didn't have a torque wrench, and if we had one, it certainly wouldn't have been calibrated. But down here in the South, we have a saying, tighter than hell and quarter of a turn, and you ought to be good to go. And that's the way we went about changing this cylinder. The engine ran for about 35 hours before it resulted in a catastrophic engine failure where the crankshaft broke. Now, luckily, there were no injuries. The airplane landed back at the airport with no injuries and no damage to the aircraft. But we certainly learned a lesson about having the technical data and tools to work on an airplane. We both, by the way, now have the torque specifications for the aircraft that we're working on. We've both gone and got A&Ps, and we both have torque wrenches, and if you go to either one of our boxes, it'll have a calibration sticker on it. So this is why your mechanic must subscribe to technical data. He must have the manuals to do the job. Continental's made that extremely easy for that to happen. For $240 a year, your mechanic has all the technical data for all Continental engines, all service bulletins, all the Continental magnetos, which was formerly the Bendix line of magnetos, and all the documentation that he needs to, and that's available online. So he doesn't have to go in and revise manuals and do all the revisions like we used to do. Now all that's real-time data, and if he's subscribed to it and can access it, he's definitely got real-time data. So make sure your mechanic knows that he has the technical data and he is using the manufacturer's recommendations, not hanger talk and wives' tales and chat room talk, but actually doing what the manufacturer recommends. Make sure that he has the technical data to do that. I can show you, there's a couple of pictures, I'm going to conclude with this, where the mechanics used improper sealant. A lot of people don't realize how important it is to use the proper sealant. Here's a mechanic that didn't want his customer to have any leaks between the crankcase halves, so he gooped it with RTV, room temperature vulcanizing material, and which is a rubbery compound. Rubber is incompressible, and it does not provide a good support surface for torque. In fact, in this particular case, this engine resulted in a catastrophic engine failure because the crankcase halves moved. They started to set up fretting between the two crankcase halves, allowing the main bearing to shift. As you can see, the main bearing rotated in its saddle there. That main bearing rotated into the fillet radius of the crankshaft and resulted in a crankshaft fracture. So it's very, very serious. Something as simple as that RTV resulted in an engine failure. And this is just because the mechanic didn't have the technical data, he didn't have the lubricants and sealants bulletin that I spoke of earlier on what to put between the crankcase halves. And just for some gee whiz information, the Continental engine, the seal between the two crankcase halves is a piece of silk thread. And that allows us to have good torque metal to metal so that we can stretch those through bolts and get the proper torque. Very, very important. And I'll conclude a little bit about product support and factory service. We at Continental have 45 team members devoted to the product support. Many of us are licensed airframe and power plant mechanics, and many of us are pilots and aircraft owners. So again, we understand the problems. We can do the work at Fairhope, Alabama. If you don't have a mechanic and you need someone that is definitely factory trained, you'd like the factory to do the work, we are capable of managing your airplane from stem to stern. We can also, many of you have probably heard of Matatuck, which we closed in New York, and we've reopened that in Fairhope, Alabama as our MRO, Continental Motor Services. And we certainly do both Lycoming and Continental engine work, and we do inspections and repair. We have a state-of-the-art cylinder facility at Continental Motor Services. We have a Sun and SV10 hone, which is the leading hone in the industry, and we can actually resurrect the dead in some ways with that. And we service all brands of cylinders there. 1 to 2 day turnaround. If we also can do diesel installations at Fairhope for some of our new diesel engines that we're doing. We also have avionics capability, and we're truly becoming a one-stop shop for all things general aviation. So if you're ever in the Mobile area, we recommend that you stop by the factory, get a tour, and come see us and talk to us at Continental Motor Services, and we'll be glad to assist you in any way we can in educating your mechanic, or if you need us to provide services on your aircraft, we can also do that as well. You can also buy factory engines from us at CMS at the number listed there as well. And we're your in-stock source for parts, for ignition systems, for airframes, magnetos, for engine parts, Lycoming and Continental. And you'll always get a friendly and knowledgeable person on the phone when you call. That concludes my presentation tonight. I invite you to go to our website at continentalmotors.aero and browse around that for technical data. Many of the things that I talked about tonight, you can print out and talk with your mechanic and review with him, and we certainly suggest that you do that. Again, I appreciate your time tonight. I appreciate you coming and logging on and listening to me. And Jeff, at this time, I'll be glad to take any questions that our people may have out there.
Sure. Thanks very much, Bill. And first, just a couple of comments. Obviously, as another AMP over here on my end, I mean, a lot of the things that you said there are just, obviously ring so true in the things that I've seen. You mentioned manuals and documentation. Obviously, that's one of the things that I've certainly seen for the entire aircraft. One of the most basic questions, right, that when people bring their aircraft in is, do you have all of the right manuals for this aircraft? And it's really unbelievable how many shops don't.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I once flew for a 135 operator where we flew Beech 18s, and we had a mechanic that put a prop on without the technical data to do so, and we almost lost the prop on the airplane. So it's unbelievable that it happens, but it does.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is for anyone out there. Good shops are open books, and not to pun on that, but they'll let you come in, they'll answer your questions, they'll show that you have everything, that they have everything, because you're not even legal if you don't have all those maintenance manuals, and they're usually also about as low pressure as can be. The only other note also here before we take questions had to do with annual inspections, which of course is where so many of us find ourselves in the shop most often. And I just want to point out for everyone to make sure they understand that as well, that's things like that are inspections only, and so you should never feel pressured if you should get discrepancies with anything that you bring in, and then feel free to make sure you find a place that knows what they're doing when it comes to repairing things, especially when you talk about engines like with what Bill presented tonight. So going to the questions now, we have a few things here. One of the things that came up, I think it's a fairly common thing to see pushrod leaks. So if you could talk a little bit about that, even on engines that don't have that many hours, if you could talk about what caused that, how to fix it, et cetera.
Yeah, with that question, with the pushrod, and I'm assuming that we're talking about pushrod tubes that are underneath the cylinders, and
yes.
And there's two types. Continental used to, on the smaller engines, the C series, and even some of the early 0200s had swedged type of pushrod tube seals where in order to remove the tube, you had to remove the cylinder. And those, in some cases, can be problematic. In order to remedy those leaks, the cylinder has to be at least partially removed from the engine in order to get those tubes out. There are conversion kits that allow for the new spring type in which you can remove the cylinder remove the tube without removing the cylinder. There are rubber grommets or rubber seals that are at both ends of the pushrod tube. One of the things that we recommend that mechanics do with those seals is to liberally put Dow Corning 4, DC4 on those to make them very pliable and to make them seat into their respective positions very well. When you replace those, you collapse the spring, and you have those items liberally soaked with DC4. Once you let go of the spring and you let that pop into position, that usually will go into position, and you'll have hours and hours of non-leaks in that area. My dad has an airplane with a C90. I did the conversion on his engine. His were problematic with the swedge type. We did the conversion kit that's available at Continental, and now he has no leaks. It's dry as a bone. And he's an aeronautical engineer, so you know it has to be perfect.
Okay, and let's see, another question that we had here has to do with overhauling of some of the different engines that are out there. You know, when you're talking about engines that have been done by RAM, those one of the questions, or by other companies, you know, I assume Continental will overhaul any of those. The 520 NBs is one of the things that one of the attendees has asked about.
Yeah, we can overhaul the engines at Continental Motor Services, but at the factory, in those particular cases, you know, we would recommend that they go with a factory rebuild. And let me review the difference there. A factory rebuild is a zero-time engine. It is manufactured from parts that are in our storeroom that meet new fit tolerances. That's different from an overhaul, which is continued time in service. And for example, if the engine had 2,000 hours and it was overhauled by Continental Motor Services or RAM or anyone out there, which there are reputable overhaul shops, no doubt, it still has 2,000 hours total time. It is 0 since major overhaul. When you're talking about an aircraft of the caliber that a TSIO 520 NB would be in, such as a Cessna 340, or you know, you're talking about some of those types of airplanes. Certainly RAM has a good market with that, but the factory engine should bring about enhanced aircraft value from the zero-time perspective over the overhaul. And in those cases, we would recommend that you go with a factory engine, and would recommend a factory engine over an overhaul, just simply because you're getting a zero-time engine.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time for this evening, and we really appreciate everyone's time in joining us. A little bit, 5 minutes over now, but thank you so much for joining us. And I want to point out to everyone that a recording of this presentation will be available via Social Flight. Anytime that you open up Social Flight on the web or on your mobile app, there is a bar at the top of the map that gives you a link to Social Flight University. And if you look in there under the section that does have to do with aircraft and maintenance, you will find a recording of this for this presentation. We should have that up tomorrow. It takes a little bit of time for us to process it, but that'll give you that, as well as the other presentations that have been made in the past as part of this series. And please join us again, because we will be having more in this series. We're scheduled about every other week right now, from Continental Motors as well as from some of the other Social Flight providers out there. So again, thank you so much, Bill. Thank you for everything and for your time tonight. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. Good night.